The eastern lands of Europe are a vast, flat area called the European Plain. It's intersected with large waterways, thick forests, and lush meadows. Such geography meant that throughout history, this land had extensive natural resources that could be used for farming, fishing, hunting, etc., supporting a large population. However, the flat lands also paved the way for an ease of access to many migrating groups, and such was the early history for most of Eastern Europe, with many tribes coming and going, but in the grand scheme of things still leaving this vast land largely unpopulated. However, one people group that would change this were the Eastern Slavs. They largely came into the vast lands of Eastern Europe during the 6th century Slavic migrations, although valid arguments can be made that some small Slavic settlements may have existed in the area for a far longer time. Nonetheless, the reason why the Eastern Slavs were the ones able to populate such a vast area is usually attributed to two main things. First, the sheer number of them, and how do we know this? Well, even though we can't know it for sure because we have no written records, archaeology combined with the fact that their western and southern brothers came into Central/Western Europe in such large numbers that even Western authors were surprised, it is most likely that Eastern Slavs did the same, maybe even on a larger scale. Second is the fact that Eastern Slavs, as opposed to the other Slavs, used a slash and burn farming method mixed with hunting and gathering. This combined with no crop rotation and very rich soil and fauna of Eastern Europe meant that they could produce a lot of food, however would have to resettle every few years due to hunting and soil depletion. However, these resources could in few years replenish and be used again by a different Slavic clan resettling. All this meant that you had a large, constantly moving, reproducing, resettling population with more than an adequate food supply, which resulted in the fact that these Slavs were able to settle this vast area and become in most regions the majority people group. Going down the mostly empty center, going northward and meeting Baltic and Finno-Ugric groups, and eventually also going south, meeting first the Avars, then the Bulgars, then the Khazars, etc. In fact, it is largely believed that by the start of the 8th century, most Eastern Slavs living in the south were forced to pay some sort of a tribute to the Khazars. The important thing to understand about these Eastern Slavs expanding into the European plain is that they weren't as homogeneous in culture and language as we may have thought. Thanks to some findings of Slavic birch bark writings in Novgorod dating back as far as the 10th century, we can tell with pretty good certainty that there was quite a bit of diversity between the many Eastern Slavic tribes that settled the European plain. And looking at much more recent historical Eastern Slavic documents, or even contemporary ones, we can tell by comparison that Eastern Slavic culture and language was very much convergent since the 10th century or even earlier. But I digress. It was also around the 8th century, and maybe in some places as early as the 7th century, that the Slavs slowly started to move from the slash and burn farming method and hunting to more reliable crop rotation farming. This meant that the chaotic autonomous nature of constant resettling started to be replaced by the creation of many small self-independent areas of farming communities. These communities were held together by the main family/clan alliances that divided up the arable and pastoral land and together defended it from outsiders. It was into the Slavic society that the famous Varangians arrived around the 8th century, although again arguments can be made that Norse people from Sweden may have come to Eastern Europe even earlier than that, but these would only be trading expeditions. However, the arrival of the Varangians in the 8th century was a much different story. Yes, some came for trade, but many of them came to plunder and settle the rich areas around the vast waterways of Eastern Europe. Side note here, the word Varangian is mostly used to describe Norse/Viking outsiders from Sweden that usually but not necessarily are in one way or another connected to the eastern lands of Europe, mostly through service to some kind of a chieftain. With these arriving Varangians also came two major changes. One was the increase in trade between the Black Sea/the Middle East and the Baltics, and that is how the Scandinavians acquired the knowledge of making Damascus steel, which came from India, prompting the creation of the famous Viking ulfberht sword. And second was the restructuring of the Eastern European predominantly Slavic society. This meant that at the beginning of the 9th century, the close-knit family communities that existed up until now started to make way for the creation of large settlements with ditches, ramparts, and marketplaces. This in turn fueled even more trade and economic development, but also the centralization of power into small chieftaincies run from these newly created fortified towns. And since most of these towns were established by incoming Varangians, most of these early chieftains were Varangians, ruling over a much larger Slavic population. However, there most likely existed some small chieftaincies around that were just Slavic. It was also during this time that a new word for the Varangians emerged, the Rus, derived from the Norse word to row, as many of the Varangians would do, rowing up and down the Eastern European waterways. But it is important to note the difference between the Rus and the Varangians. Unlike the Varangians, the Rus mostly refer to Norse people born and living in Eastern Europe, including the many chieftains. This is why foreign writers like Ahmed ibn Fadlan, who wrote the first-hand account of a Viking funeral, referred to the Norsemen as the Rus, because they came from Eastern Europe, not Scandinavia. But the word Rus later started to be used not just for the Norse people and the chieftains, but also their subjects, which were mostly Slavic. This combined with the fact that the Rus chieftains and people over time assimilated into the much larger Slavic population, the word Rus kind of got assimilated as well, with all Eastern Slavs being called the Rus by around the 11th and 12th century. But going back to the 9th century, from here, as it so often does, some chieftaincies started to grow more powerful than others and absorb the weaker ones, forming large town centers, some of which we would even recognize today. And this is where most historians start referring to one of the most important Eastern European historical documents, the Nestor's Chronicle, or the Primary Chronicle, or just Povest. Now there's many problems with the Primary Chronicle that could have its own entire video, like for example the fact that it most likely wasn't even written by Nestor, or that it was written 200 to 300 years after the certain events it talks about, or the fact that it starts off with a mistake stating the wrong starting date of Michael III's reign, etc. However, this is not to say that we should dismiss the entire Primary Chronicle, because not all of it that we can check with archaeology or other documents is wrong. Just some of it is. Therefore, we have to be aware that the events it talks about that we at the moment can check with other means may be wrong or altered from the truth. So with that in mind, I will cite the Primary Chronicle, however also combine it with any other possible sources to try to get the most complete picture as it stands. The Primary Chronicle states that the Slavic tribes, along with some Finno-Ugric tribes, rebelled against their Varangian overlords and chased them out of the lands of Eastern Europe in the early 9th century. Now, this may be true for some chieftaincies that existed at the time, but Eastern Europe wasn't one big unified area, and what may have occurred in one of the chieftaincies probably didn't happen in all of them. After that, it is said that the people who threw out the Varangians started to squabble amongst themselves and chaos ensued. To fix this problem, some of these tribes invited back the Varangians to restore order. The Varangians agreed and came in 860 to 862 with a large force led by a person named Rurik. However, it is debated if Rurik really came being invited or just came as another conqueror trying to get land for himself, just like many Vikings did in Western Europe. It is also very likely that Rurik came to take land from another Varangian/Rus, and the expulsion story never happened, being invented years later to make it seem like a union between the Varangians and the Slavs, not a conquest. There's also a Byzantine source stating a Rus siege of Constantinople in 860 where the Rus laid siege to the city before retreating. This is the same year as the early estimate of Rurik's arrival to Eastern Europe, so we know it wasn't Rurik. It may have been a different Rus chieftain of Eastern Europe, or it may have been an independent raiding expedition of some Rus people wanting to get rich, or it may have been an expedition by the chief of the northern lands that Rurik was now conquering. The latter would make some sense, as Rurik would naturally want to attack during the absence of the chieftain and his army. On top of that, the Byzantine sources state that the Rus suddenly lifted the siege, leaving even though they had the upper hand. So it may have well been the chieftain quickly trying to get back to his lands because Rurik was there. Whatever may have happened, we know that Rurik won, solidifying his reign over the northern lands and supposedly founding Novgorod in the later half of the 9th century. But this has been disproven, as archaeological finds date the settlement of Veliki Novgorod to late 10th century. However, this probably was just a misinterpretation, as Novgorod just means new city or new fortification, so Rurik's new city wasn't the new city. Shortly after that, Rurik died in 879, leaving his kingdom and a very young son, Igor, to quote-unquote his kin, Oleg. The Primary Chronicle states that Oleg went on an expansionist campaign, conquering many chieftaincies and cities, including Kiev in 882, which he promptly named as the capital of a kingdom from then on known as the Kievan Rus. He then died in 912, after which Igor, Rurik's son, succeeded him. but there's a Khazar letter from 940 mentioning Oleg being the king of the Rus, well after the primary chronicle states that he died. So this prompted some historians to think that maybe Oleg didn't really die in 912, but actually had a power struggle with Igor well into the 9th century. Whichever it may have been, Igor did succeed Oleg, eventually becoming the king of the Kievan Rus. In the 940s, he went on to fight the Byzantines, probably oversaw some raiding expeditions along the Caspian Sea, and eventually was killed by his own subjects for demanding too many tributes/taxes in 945. But his wife Olga took the initiative, and as a regent for their young son Sviatoslav, hunted down the people that killed her husband, established new frontier castles, centralized the power within the kingdom, and enacted first ever law reforms in Eastern Europe. She was also the first high-ranking person in Eastern Europe to convert to Christianity in Constantinople, and therefore today she's known as Saint Olga of Kiev. And even though his mother was a Christian, Sviatoslav was a starch pagan his entire life. With that said, Sviatoslav fought many successful wars against the Byzantines, the Bulgars, the Khazars, who were replaced by another invading nomadic group, the Pechenegs, etc., forming at the time the largest empire in Europe. However, in 970, his streak would end being defeated by the Byzantines, who then bribed the Pechenegs to ambush him on his way home from the unsuccessful campaign. The ambush was successful, killing Sviatoslav in 972, and since he didn't have time to solidify most of his conquests, lots of the land he conquered was lost in the subsequent 6-year-long succession crisis between his 3 sons. The eldest, Yaropolk, Prince of Kiev, the second eldest, Oleg, Prince of Drelinia, and the youngest, and also a bastard, Vladimir, Prince of Novgorod. Yaropolk in Kiev was poised to become the king of the Rus, and as such waited to find a casus belli for attacking one of his brothers, and when one dubious claim came in 977, he seized on the opportunity and attacked Oleg, quickly conquering Drelinia and killing his brother. He then turned his attention to Vladimir, but after Vladimir found out about his brother's death, he knew that the balance of power within the kingdom wasn't in his favor and fled, leaving Yaropolk as the sole ruler of Kievan Rus. But Vladimir had a plan in mind. He fled to Scandinavia to one of his relatives, Hakon Sigurdsson, a vassal king of Norway under the famous Harald Bluetooth. He asked Hakon for help, who did, but Vladimir most likely heavily recruited soldiers on his own, promising land, money, and seats at his court once they retake Kievan Rus. With this new Varangian army assembled, Vladimir returned to Eastern Europe. However, on his way to Kiev, he stopped by Polotsk and asked the local princess to marry him. She refused to marry a bastard, and so Vladimir did the only sensible thing he could have done. Conquered the entire town, killed her father, and forced her to marry him anyways. After that, he also conquered Smolensk, after which he could finally move on to besiege Kiev, where in 978, through deceit, he managed to kill his brother, Yaropolk, ending the 6-year-long succession crisis. Vladimir went on to solidify his kingdom and reconquer most of the lands lost since his father's death. But at this point, Kievan Rus was a cultural and religious melting pot. Most of the peasants practiced Slavic paganism, but there were also Khazar Jews, Norse pagans, Volga Bulgar Muslims, Finno-Ugric pagans, Christians, and even the nobility practiced a weird mixture of Norse Slavic paganism. All of these different religious beliefs naturally didn't provide much stability to the kingdom, so Vladimir decided it's time to reform the religion of the Rus people and send out envoys to go find out more about all the various religions. He was put off by Islam's taboo on drinking, stating that drinking is the joy of all Rus. We cannot exist without that pleasure. He rejected Judaism as well, as he didn't like the fact that they lost control of their Holy Land. And in the end, he settled on Orthodox Christianity, being told their churches were much more lavish and grandiose than the ones of the Catholics in the West. Vladimir was baptized in 988 and set about converting the rest of his subjects, effectively closing the pages of the formerly pagan Kievan Rus. That is where I will end my early Eastern Slavic history video. Please consider subscribing and or supporting me on Patreon. I'm also planning to do more early history of certain people groups at some point in the future, so if you're into that, stick around for history.